you very much for being here and giving me an opportunity to speak with all of you about something that I'm extremely passionate about. And that's, we have a tremendous privilege when we get to teach principles courses, because it's a requirement. And almost every institution requires that students take 2 semesters of principles courses, which gives us an opportunity to correct the wrongs that have been made in the teaching of economics in the past. So that's what I want to talk about, is basically how our limited perception of a quantified supply and demand, equilibrium-based efficiency model has actually helped to promote a lot of the ills that we're contending with today, specific to climate change activity and other issues related to anthropogenic impacts on the earth around us. First of all, arguably, economics, and as a prior speaker, or previous speaker actually had noted, is very male-dominated. And sometimes when we look at where the curriculum comes from, where the thought process comes from, where the theory comes from, that has a lot to do with how one particular group of people may have perceived the world based on their personal empowerment within that world. And I think it's very important for us to think about it from that perspective. Today we realize that away is in our backyard. There is no such thing. We have a better understanding that control does not necessarily mean that we will not have responsibility related to that control. So sustainability is actually directly tied to economics, and it should always have been considered a part of economics, because after all, economics is about resources. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is my particular take on how I integrate sustainability into the principles curriculum, and why I think it's actually our moral duty to do so, because we live at a time where people have to start to take on responsibility of changing the framework that they've been born into. Before I get started, I just should also tell you I believe in context. Context is extremely important. So my context is I got my PhD, but then I left after doing my postdoc and went into the private sector in the area of finance. I worked in financial services as an equity analyst and then investor relations officer for several years before I came back to academics. But during that time period, what I learned a lot about was the importance of social responsibility, and how in the United States, the concept of corporate social responsibility specifically has really been a marketing tool. It's been used for branding. So even though we talk about sustainability, we're still using the same economic tools that have gotten us into this problem as a means to get out of this problem. And I'd hope to highlight that with you briefly. So my presentation outcome is really already what I've basically said to you, which is to look at creating the tangibility in our students with regard to how economics is directly related to the climate change issues we see around us today. To give them that understanding of how they can actually be not just an observer of the world around them, but an active participant in that world and making the changes that need to be made. So the most simple thing that we talk about in the very beginning of our courses is this concept of scarcity and abundance. I'm hoping that most of you bring that topic up, because when we talk about Adam Smith, which we have to bring up some aspects of history of economic thought when we start to lay the foundations of our principles, we actually are talking about the irrationality of scarcity and abundance. What do we need to live? What are the 3 basic things we need to live? Anybody? Water. Food. Air. Air, water, and food are the 3 things that we pollute the most, and those are the basic things that we need the most, just to basically survive. Not shelter, not clothing. Those are extras. But we don't value any of those. And the fact that we consider polluting them externalities, and we teach it that way without actually talking about how our values should have actually created them as part of our demand function, is an opportunity that we have for the future. So scarcity and abundance is a paradox, right? Everything is scarce. There is nothing that's really abundant unless there are not enough people in the environment. So values drive behavior. And that's really important, because when we talk about demand functions and we talk to our students about demand and supply and equilibrium, we talk about preferences and we talk about income in terms of movements of our demand function. But also embedded within your demand function are your values. What do you value? Is social justice important to you? Is environmental justice important to you? Is economic equity important to you? Those are the 3 pillars of sustainability. If those are important to you, how are your consumption decisions aligned to those 3 things? In most cases, people do things every single day that are directly not aligned to their supposed beliefs or values. We're all sitting here, and there's bottled water on the table, plastic bottled water. And that's an issue, because that shows a direct lack of alignment with what's going on in the world around us. It's a petroleum-based product that makes plastic. 20% of greenhouse gas emissions will be attributable to the plastic industry by 2050 based on present consumption levels. So right there is a simple example to use in a classroom of how our pricing has determined what we purchase when pricing is inefficient because it doesn't take into consideration the life cycle impact of the true cost. So the other thing we all have probably brought up at some point or another is the PPF. So when we think about the production possibilities frontier, there's a cultural attribution to this, a cultural attribution that goes back to my state, Massachusetts. That's where I currently live, with this idea that somehow, because resources are available, it's our duty and functional responsibility to use them up to the maximum available, without thinking about the risk buffer that may be needed. And what I mean by that is what we don't know should be as important to us as what we supposedly know. And we don't have to look too far, even in the human world, to determine that. You can look at the 2008 financial crisis. Where was risk management in that crisis? Risk management only came into real being in terms of companies starting to bolster their risk management areas after the crisis hit in the financial services sector. And I happened to work for two companies that were hit. I worked for AIG, and then I worked for the Hartford Financial Services Group, because a subsidiary that I oversaw at AIG was purchased by MetLife. We were in a solvency crisis at AIG, as you might remember. But had we had risk management, had that value for mitigating or minimizing risk existed within our structure, right, then we probably would not have put ourselves in situations where we're looking for that risk-reward trade-off, right? It's the same kind of thing that we're looking at today, is we are still looking at the maximum usage of resources in order to propel our economy, because that is fundamentally what potential GDP is. So it's so intrinsic within our system that this concept of maximizing resources without thinking about risk continues to occur repeatedly. I had a talk with a bunch of students last night, and I asked, what is that thing called? Because the word escaped me. When you keep trying to do something over and over again and you're looking for a different result, they reminded me it's called insanity. But it's also called the repetition of history, right? We see history repeat over and over again. And the main reason we do is because each generation somehow thinks they got it better than the one before them, so they can do the same dumb things, and it's going to be a different outcome. There is no free lunch, and our economic system can actually be changed to incorporate risk and incorporate our values, and that could actually help our students who may not become econ majors and never take another econ class understand the power and responsibility of their consumption choices. So probably most of you know this already, but the sources of greenhouse gases the primary one is energy, second one is transportation, third one arguably is agriculture. All of those have economics stamped all over them. So we teach this in our principles curriculum when we talk about macro, and we also talk about it because it feeds in from the micro component. But consumption spending is what drives our economy, which means that a rational economic agent, in my opinion, needs to be thought of as wearing three hats. The member of the government, because you hire in people to regulate you, but to the extent you don't necessarily get to know anything about their values, you're hiring in the bad people to get in, perhaps just on marketing alone, which is based on spending, right? We're investors because we all want to have something in terms of our pensions and our retirement. And then we're also consumers. But on the pension, retirement, the investment side, and the consumer side, to the extent we're looking at low prices and high returns, we're actually exacerbating the issues related to inefficiency in the marketplace. Because prices are only as efficient as the equalization of the power between the supply and the demand function. Otherwise, efficiency is not necessarily what you find at equilibrium. What you find at equilibrium is who has the greater power of exploitation. So when we look at GDP in the US, and this isn't a shock to any of us, we know that from when the indicator was created around the 1930s and then adopted in the 1940s globally, there's a trajectory, a slope, because we have one indicator that we're focused on, and that indicator is an indication of how strong our economy is, right? Just like if a student is focused on their GPA, they're going to have a really strong GPA. They're going to probably take really simple classes, perhaps, just to make sure it's high, because that's the end focus. What we focus on is usually what we end up attaining. So where does that translate in terms of the issues that I'm bringing up here? Well, consumption alone, without taking into consideration the values or the sustainability aspects, leads to these kinds of outcomes, right? That's a teakwood forest in Bali, that's in Manila Bay, and then that is a strip mine. So consumption without taking into consideration the values or the responsibility inherent in demand leads to adverse consequences that are not factored or priced into the market, because we as economists, somewhere down the line and repeated over generational time, have labeled these as things that are outside the confines of the market system. So what does that mean in terms of carbon emissions? We need energy in order to drive the economy. And what's happened, you all probably see the slope. The slope of that line is very similar to the slope of the GDP function that I showed you a little while ago. Energy production, or CO2 emissions, have increased at the same level as GDP in terms of a slope of the increase. When we look at that in terms of climate change, what we're talking about today is the speed of climate change activity. There's a misnomer in calling it climate change, because climate change has always existed, and that turns off a lot of people. But you just need to add that one word, speed of climate change, then it makes a whole lot more sense. The speed of our economic growth has required a whole lot of energy production, and the primary source of energy production has been fossil fuels. So that's increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. But where we are today is above 400 parts per million, which is significant, because we know, looking over 600,000 years of historical data, that from ice coring, that we have never seen this high number of parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere in the past. And if you look at that, that's why the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, noted that it was an anthropogenic impact on the planet, the human-made impact, which is our economic model. You cannot say it's not. It's directly correlated to how we perceive externalities and how we embed them in terms of our decision-making, and how we've been absolved from that responsibility by just talking about market efficiency. So the last 70 years are where we pretty much have peaked out of that little zone of 300, whereas our comfort zone is. And today we're above 407 parts per million. So I'm just going to go over a couple of things where I actually talk about this in my class. I usually give this type of a background at different times as it's relevant. But then I also then show them things, because most of my students have noted adverse weather-related events, adverse health-related events, other types of issues, depending upon where you live, that are geographically segregated, but also definitely attributed to climate change in those areas. So what does this mean for us? CO2 obviously is being released at a faster rate than ever before. And I wanted to show you a couple pictures, because this is also something I think is so important. Economics, in order to be really the type of discipline that it should have, in terms of the power that it's given, needs to be taking and embracing other disciplines in the discussion. We need to be looking at science. We need to be able to tell our students the reason why climate change is important is because that's basically how thin the membrane is of our Earth. So, and we need to be able to tell them and explain to them why greenhouse gases are an issue. This is just basically telling you how the radiation comes through and what happens and how it stays in. It's only when it's tangible, when people can understand the actual mechanisms, that you're going to be able to have that conversation. So these are the things that are going on in the world around us, and these are the things that are related to the way that we have chosen to grow our economy. And this is exactly what's also happened in terms of temperatures. And we know this because these are global mean temperatures. And what you'll be able to see very quickly by looking at this time duration graphic is that our mean temperature has actually increased in a very short amount of time. On an annual basis, we're always hitting a higher mark. And this is where we need to step back and we need to talk, even though we're an economist, we can talk and attribute this to economic systems. But we need to be able to explain also at this point, average global temperatures doesn't mean that every place is getting hotter. What is an average? An average can have a multitude of values in it, high and low. So this is a learning experience where they can take into consideration the importance of understanding data, range, and then coming up with an average as well. So these slides are just examples to be able to make it tangible to the students to see what's happened, because one of the biggest issues with regard to economics, especially when we all talk about poverty, and the Nobel Prize was just one released recently related to poverty issues, is that these issues are speaking points. They're not empathy points. And we teach a discipline that should have an empathy component. Anyone who says it's an objective discipline doesn't realize that every time we open our mouth, even when we speak in a mathematical equation, we are making a normative statement. There's nothing that we do that's objective, because we determine the variables that are included in that equation. We determine how we're going to state that equation. So somewhere along the line, we have a responsibility to explain. We have a responsibility to try to get people into the discussion and understand where their relationship is too. So I'm just going to go through a couple points here. So the heat index we know has gone up. We know that this is going to happen. This ties directly into economics. As areas of the world become uninhabitable, what does that mean? Then we also have an issue with storm activity, weather-related events, climate catastrophe. It ties into the economics of insurance companies. It ties into morbidity as well as mortality and property and casualty risk. So we know that this has happened. When you have drought, severe drought, then you have severe downpours, which means you have flooding. So these are some pictures of those downpours. And then you have this next set of things occurring, which are morbidity risk, which is infectious disease. And the fact that now we have season-changing events occurring, which ties directly into certain sectors in the economy, specifically. Health sector is going to be definitely affected. But infectious diseases have increased. This was from 2015, this quote, but some of you may recall that earlier this same year, somebody has declared in the US that climate change is a medical emergency yet again. This is a pine beetle. The pine beetle is now reproducing at a much faster rate. It's able to go through 2 evolutionary cycles in typically one of its seasons. So in Colorado, it's related to the death of all of these pine trees, which made them perfect tinder for fires. But we also know fires have been increasing because heat has increased, right? Global heat. So how does that affect us? It affects us through food. So that's going to be my next point here. Because if you have drought, you have fire, a lot of times you'll also have issues with being able to grow in your agricultural seasons. So these are just pictures here. But then the other issue is that as the temperature rises, we also have an increase in lightning strikes, which means there's a causal loop that keeps on occurring. So the food price index has gone up. Now that's to the advantage of developed countries that can afford it, and it further impoverishes those developing countries. And there is an irony here when we talk about those developing countries as well, isn't there? Because GDP is a metric that was made for Western countries because it fits the Western framework. It has been imposed on other countries for which it may not necessarily fit their cultural or resource framework. So water is becoming a big issue. In the United States, we have a big water issue too, except in our case, we have an issue with privatization of water and then having it resold to us at 1,000 times the cost. So in terms of going back to the GDP indicator, water scarcity has already been predicted to adversely impact many countries. And water depletion will probably cause other issues in terms of our own ability to grow. But this is where the GMO discussion occurs, right? I told you we polluted our air, we pollute our water, we polluted our food. Because we're so focused on speed to market, getting that fast return by coming up with some new product that somehow is going to be a quick fix and a free lunch. What is that word again? What was that word that started with an I? I forgot what it's called. Insanity. Yeah. Even though it's been happening for all these different decades, somehow when we create it, it's not going to be a problem. So These are the issues that our economic model actually fosters. And then, since we look at everything in terms of a GDP, all of these costs actually will lead to an erosion of GDP as we know it, but at the same time, fixing all of them will add to an benefit to GDP, right? Because there's a perversion in GDP that it doesn't really matter whether it's a good thing or a bad thing as long as it's a quantified thing. So having our people die of cancer or having shortened lives or shortened quality of life doesn't matter as long as somebody's paying for the health care. So I'm just going to talk about two more things here, and then I'll close up. I believe the problem lies right now with the fact that we're using the same indicators that we use to get into this problem to fix this problem. And we're going to talk about the Paris Agreement in 1 second. But I think we have to start thinking, when we look at principles, this is a great opportunity to talk about something different that we could do differently, that gives them a different understanding of how values could implicitly be incorporated within their lifetime. So my favorite person to talk about, not partisan politics here at all, okay? But this is Jimmy Carter. And some of you may know him from Habitat Humanity, but I know him as a president who walked down the plane and shook my hand like he was in the news about doing just a little while ago. But Jimmy Carter in 1979 had a State of the Union address, and that was also called the Culture of Malaise talk. And that particular talk, he said it was our patriotic duty to reduce our consumption of energy. He said that we'd become a nation of consumers, that was all that we were focused on. We'd bought into this marketing myth that somehow that gave us value. If you think about it, that marketing myth is all based on a GDP functional system, right? You have to have that whole system work. What he was actually talking about is that we needed to change what mattered to us and live by that. In the last 40 years since that speech, we have increased our dependence on energy tremendously. There were no cell phones when Jimmy was speaking then. We can't live without our phone now. Everything we need and everything we use has some energy component attached to it, which makes us more dependent on energy than ever before, which is one of the reasons why it's very hard to comply with the Paris Agreement when you're one of the highest emitters in the world. Because fundamentally, we're 65% based on fossil fuels. Our reduction in fossil fuel use will impact our GDP growth rate because we don't have the energy infrastructure that's green, nor do we have people who are willing to cut back on use because we think it's our right. This is where the whole concept of values is really important in economics, in the system of externalities and thinking about externalities. Prices are not necessarily indicative of the value of these elements, are they? So the foundations of sustainability come out of the Brundtland Commission report. And the Brundtland Commission report actually first defines sustainability. It's a very comparable definition to what we think of economics as being. But the one thing I found very shocking when I first looked at this document several years ago was that this is the first time that the United Nations actually paired economics and environmental policy together. So if there is nothing that shows us that we have been doing it wrong for a while, this should be, because it shouldn't have taken to the 80s for us to couple those two together. We, as economists, should have been able to tell the world that they should have been together from the very beginning. After all, are we not in the discipline of managing scarce resources against human wants or needs? So, of course, there's the Paris Agreement. And I've made an allusion to it. The Paris Agreement is all about emissions reductions. But I did show you those two graphics at the very beginning. We're very GDP focused. We're very power needy in order to be able to grow our GDP depending upon whether we're a fossil fuel-based economy or not. So the Paris Agreement requires countries, without any enforcement, to come up with some sort of vehicle to reduce emissions. The highest emitter in the world is the United States. From 1875 to 2011, we emitted 27% of the cumulative CO2 emissions. The next highest level is 25%, and that's a combination of countries we call the EU. Our pulling out of the Paris Agreement is not a big shock. We didn't really comply with Kyoto either. But it's related to our fixation on GDP to some extent. It's related to our fixation on re-election campaigns and satisfying the needs of the consumer and the desire for people to get as much as they want, and because they value themselves based on their accumulation and how much they have, as opposed to other characteristics. So in many ways, it's a culmination of multi-generational warnings that we have not paid heed to on multiple levels. Sustainable development goals are primarily focused on poverty, but again, this is another, in my opinion, oxymoron. If you look at each one of these sustainable development goals, which is what I also try to do in my principles classes, at least introduce my students to them so they understand what the meaning and significance are. If you look at what the goal is relative to how that measurement of that goal in terms of its attainment is it's a macroeconomic indicator. Unemployment, income, GDP growth. The same metrics that have presumably gotten us into this position are being used as the measurement tools of what's going to get us out. And the concept of values and how we're going to bring those values in play to somehow augment the way that these are practiced is not included. So this is what my last slide. Well, actually, I have one more slide. But I am a very empathetic individual. I have a strong passion for this. I believe it's my moral responsibility. I believe as a discipline, it's our ethical responsibility. I have a nonprofit that I also do this in because I want to take what I believe is a lack of economic literacy in the general public to the general public so that they can understand the life cycle impact of what their consumption choices are. And we show films, we show sustainability-based documentary films, and we also have a regulatory initiative on Cape Cod, which is where I live. It's comprised of 15 towns, and the reason why I picked on the bottles is because we have a bottle ban in place. So if we win this, we will be the first county in the United States made up of towns that would have passed a ban against single-use plastic water bottles. But it's important. It's a first step. It's not the last step. It's a first step to getting people to understand the true cost of their consumption choices and who's really bearing that cost. So with that, I'll thank you so much.